All right, so continuing from our last video, since CMMC 2.0 was announced last week, everybody's wanted to know what this means for GCC and GCC High in terms of compliance with CMMC. So I'm here to answer a couple questions. The first one, of course, being what's changed? That one's easy. For those of you here for the TLDR, too long, don't read. Nothing has changed. Now, you can't go back to your CEO with this. I'm going to go ahead and go through some of my former slides explaining why your decision to go with commercial GCC or GCC High has nothing to do with CMMC. So, first off, and I'm going to get out of the way here. First off, we need to know how we got to CMMC. Now, I've presented this a number of times in past slides, but it's important to remember that the Federal Acquisition Regulation is augmented by the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, DFARS, and specifically Clause 7012, which mandates NIST 800-171. Now, with CMMC 1.0, that was put into action by DFARS 7021, and the rest of this is extraneous data. If you want more information, you can watch the video we just did that talks about how we got to CMMC 2.0. But it is important to remember that DFARS 7021 did not eliminate 7012. DFARS 7012 did not eliminate the FAR. These all stack on top of each other. So the next thing I want to talk about is data residency versus data sovereignty. This is going to be really important in about 2 slides. Data residency is something you hear when you think about, or when you hear about GDPR, when you hear about data residency in terms of citizens of a country where their data must reside in a certain place. You hear Facebook, Instagram, all of those companies running into issues, usually in Ireland, for where their information stays. Data sovereignty is a different beast. With data residency, that data can stay in one place but go anywhere. With data sovereignty, that data has to stay within the specific confines of a geographic or governmental political area. This is going to be another thing to consider here in a minute. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is what is GCC High and how the environments are stacked. Again, I've done this slide a number of times, so I'm going to just kind of brush through this as quickly as possible so you can understand the architecture and why things lay where they do. So in the beginning, there was Office 365. We all know and love it. It's commercial. Now, the government community cloud was built to meet the needs of state, local, and federal governments that had to protect the information of their citizens. And for that, Microsoft created GCC. Now, this all lives on Azure Commercial. Azure Commercial is a global infrastructure. It has follow the sun support, meaning that if you call for support at 6 p.m. and the call centers are open in Bangladesh, you will get someone in Bangladesh to answer that call. Additionally, the engineers, because it's the cloud, can work from anywhere. And so the support personnel monitoring the infrastructure are also global. Azure has global availability. This is a great, wonderful thing. And it works for data residency. It does not work for data sovereignty. Finally, there's Dynamics 365. Now, with GCC, there was a requirement to have a cloud environment for SaaS providers, software as a service providers, who were giving services to state, local, and federal governments. So Microsoft created Azure Government, which had data sovereignty. And we'll talk a little bit about the specific requirements around the environment as well as the personnel here in a moment. Now, on top of that, Microsoft built the Office 365 DoD environment for the Department of Defense. This was great, data sovereignty. It had impact level 5, everything the DoD needed. But what this left was a gap for defense contractors who needed to work with the DoD because there was no cloud environment that could meet the requirements of DFARS 7012, which we spoke about a minute ago, and I'll explain this a little bit more in depth in a second. So in order to provide an environment for the defense industrial base, Microsoft created GCC High. Now, what you see here are the SRG impact levels. 4 and 5 are the ones that we're focused on for GCC High and DoD. And then off here at the edge, we also have as your government secret, which is impact level 6. Don't ask me about it. You're not getting in without the help of your contracting agency. All right. So now let's talk about compliance against the different Microsoft 365 enclaves. The points we want to look at here specifically are DFARS 7012, ITAR, CUI and CDI, NIST 800-171, and then CMMC levels. So when we look at Microsoft Commercial, you can see that DFARS 7012, it cannot be met. And now I want to slow down for a second and explain why. DFARS 7012, which mandated NIST 800-171, has its own protections or own requirements for reporting cyber incidents. And as part of that, there is a requirement that you are able to hold forensic data for a specified amount of time. Microsoft will not contractually support this onerous requirement in commercial for what they charge. And again, because there's no DFARS, you can see no ITAR, no CUI, but you can see NIST 800-171. I'll get into that as well. And CMMC level 1. Now, the reason why it can meet NIST 800-171 is there is no requirement for environment. You're going to hear me chant that a number of times before the end of this video. No requirement for environment. So, NIST 800-171 can be met in commercial. Now, in terms of GCC, the Government Community Cloud, now you see that this does have the ability to meet DFARS and the important part here is with contractual flowdowns. So if you have contractual requirements to meet DFARS 7012 in terms of holding forensic data in the event of a cyber incident, GCC High or GCC is sufficient to meet DFARS 7012. It is insufficient for ITAR. You can manage CUI. However, you can only manage non-specified CUI. And I'll explain that again in the next slide in a much deeper way. And of course, it will meet NIST 800-171 and will meet CMMC level 2 and 3. Now, GCC High. GCC High is a data sovereign environment. And here's where you start to see the big impacts. So yes, DFARS, yes, ITAR, yes, without the little star for CUI and CDI, that it can manage export controlled and classified information. NIST 800-171 is a yes, and CMMC all levels 1 through 3. And then, of course, DoD is just here. So what I want to talk about real quickly is the difference in screening for personnel between GCC and GCC High. So GCC and GCC High have all of the same classifications here between citizenship and fingerprint check. However, their background checks are different. GCC has a criminal justice information systems background screening, which is state-educated review of criminal history. Now, in terms of GCC High, this is a DoD IT2 adjudication based on a successful Office of Personnel Management Tier 3 investigation. This is the same background check as if you were going to manage classified information without having a classified clearance. This means that the environment and the people working in it are capable of meeting these higher watermarked controls for controlled and classified information with export controls. So now let's align CMMC 2.0 levels to the Microsoft environments with what we know so far. So what environment do you need for CMMC 2.0? Well, let's start with federal contract information, which aligned with the old levels 1 and 2 and is now CMMC level 1. For this, you can easily use Microsoft Commercial. Now let's look at controlled and classified information. This is a bit different. Remember that it was DFARS 7012 that mandated NIST 800-171 for protecting CUI. To meet DFARS 7012 incident reporting requirements, you must use GCC or GCC High. However, to meet CMMC level 2 and 3, you can technically use commercial, as there is, like I said, no requirement for environment in either CMMC or NIST 800-171 at this time. There is still documentation we're waiting on. Now, Let's talk about CMMC Level 3 and NIST 800-172. Again, there is still no requirement for environment, so you can technically get by with commercial if you ignore DFARS. This is important if you're watching this video in 5 years and CMMC has rolled out to the entire federal acquisition system, which we expect it to, because you may not be subject to DFARS and you may not be using CMMC to protect controlled and classified information. But for now, it is important to set that aside and know that if you are subject to DFARS, you definitely need GCC or GCC High. So why would you pick GCC over GCC High or one environment over another? Well, export controls like ITAR and EAR, marked CUI like controlled technical information, CTI, nuclear and space contracts, and anything with no foreign markings require data sovereignty. They have to stay in the US. And for specified CUI, that requires US citizens, background cleared individuals, and data sovereignty. So taking it back down to a nutshell, in commercial, you can meet CMMC level 1. In GCC, you can meet CMMC levels 2 and 3 with the caveat that it has to be unspecified CUI. And in GCC High, you can meet CMMC levels 2 and 3 along with specified CUI with export controls like ITAR, NASA, no foreign, CDI, etc. So hopefully this was helpful, but of course we are still waiting for the DoD to release the next bit of information and what CMMC 2.0 is really going to look like. Once we know that, I'll be back to give you a hand. Once again, please, if you have any questions or comments, leave them below in the comments section. Give us a like and follow. I love to answer questions. I love to know that my content is helpful, and I love to hear your suggestions on how to make it better. Thanks a lot and have a great day.